Folks, what's going on? HeirofCarthage here, and got a little something special for you today. I wanted to speak to those of you who enjoy this. Do you enjoy unleashing volley after volley of devastating artillery fire in a Total War game? Specifically Total War Warhammer II today. Well, if you do, then you're in luck. So we're going to talk a little bit about how some of this artillery works as kind of just like a basic crash course. This will be familiar to some of those of you who are more veteran to the game, but this is intended for those who may have something to learn or know they have something to learn. We're going to cover a little bit about how different units fire, how it can be used effectively. This is not going to be an end-all exhaustive look into all artillery. That will take a long time, and even this video is fairly long, but I'm hoping that it teaches you a few important things about how to pick your artillery, how to target it, and how to make it more effective in battle, so that even though this dream right here is a little bit fake because it's in the laboratory, you can at least be living more of this in your battles and throughout your campaigns. Alright, so as mentioned in the intro, we're going to be discussing artillery a little bit today, and I kind of have an agenda of things that I want to cover. I may splice in some footage from battle during some of this. I may not, just kind of depends on where it's appropriate as I'm going through the editing. But let's just kind of have a chat real quick, and then I want to go demonstrate a few things that happen in battle. All right, so one of the first things I want to cover is the different types of artillery that are in the game. Now, these are going to fall into several categories, but I'm going to go through these. So the types of artillery based on firing arc. You're going to have a low arc of fire and a high arc of fire. And what I mean by that is some artillery will fire low and flat to the ground, while others will fire high in a nice arcing and ballistic trajectory. And I've got an example of each here. A great cannon would be your typical low arc, fast projectile, whereas a Hellstorm rocket battery would be more representative of a high arc, slower projectile type of artillery. So these are kind of the two basic categories. But beyond these two categories, each artillery, I would say, also has a shot type. So single projectile, like say this Lumen Arc of Hysh, which would also fall in a low if no arc. And then you would also have multiple projectiles, so like the cannon and the Hellstorm rocket battery. They fire multiple projectiles per volley. So you can have both. Now, lastly, I would say that there is also a range variant to artillery. And again, we'll use the Empire for an example. The cannon has a range of 450. I would put this in a long range category. Whereas a Hellblaster volley gun with a range of 290 would fall into more of what I would call a mid-range type artillery. So those are kind of categories. Low arc, high arc, single projectile, multiple projectile, long range, or mid-range. Each of these can play a role on the function of an artillery piece in battle and its uses, and we need to understand those. As an example, low arc artillery, such as a cannon and others, tend to fire a relatively fast projectile that tends to be better against a single entity monster, a very large target or groups of cavalry or large units. And a lot of these units tend to come with a pretty nice armor-piercing damage component, which allows them to do a lot of damage to large, high-value targets. Now, that doesn't mean they don't have any purpose against, let's say, an infantry unit with multiple models, but it's just what they tend to excel at. Whereas, for instance, a Hellblaster volley gun is only mid-range, but it specializes in damage against infantry units. Now, before we go any further, talking about what these artillery pieces are good for, or how do we use them, I think it's going to be important to dive into a couple of pieces of battle footage and let you all see how some of these different artillery pieces function. I think it's very important to understand how they function because it will help you understand why and how you use them. I'm here in a custom battle with Warner95, who's one of the moderators from my Discord. He's helping me to demonstrate this today. And the first piece we're going to bring out here is an Empire Mortar. And this mortar is going to represent a high arc, multiple projectile, long range artillery piece. And I want you to see how it's going to function because I think this is pretty important to understand. It can fire from relatively long range, and it fires in a very high arc, and it's a relatively slow moving projectile. And I think it's important for you all to see here how these projectiles function. So we got the first shot. going to speed up my scroll speed so we can get over here and you can watch how it impacts. When fired from range, a unit like the Mortar is going to have a pretty wide spread to its projectiles. And this is important to understand in knowing how to use it dependent on the range and the target that you're going for. Generally speaking, a Mortar is going to be best used against fairly tightly packed groups of multiple entities. So that would be like an infantry unit, ideally, or, say a foot missile unit. I want you to notice something. That first volley came down, spread fairly wide, and as this unit gets closer and closer to the Mortar, you're going to notice that the volleys tighten up. So the Mortar is going to be shooting a tighter pattern as a target gets closer to the artillery piece itself. So you're going to see that pattern tighten up, and the damage start to intensify despite the fact that the unit is actually presenting a smaller target. So again, this is a very important behavior to understand. The farther away your target is, the less likely that your pattern is going to land in a dense formation, and ergo, you would be better off to target a blobbed group of enemies from long range, whereas you can better focus a key unit from a shorter range. Alright, next up here, Warner and I have the dwarves, and I'm going to demonstrate another artillery piece. This one is going to be a Dwarf Cannon. This is a low arc, multiple projectile, long range artillery piece. You can see that the artillery itself tends to target the center mass if it's being fired at a unit with multiple entities. Now I will show you it firing at a single entity here in a moment, just to give you some ideas of how it functions. But again, that was the longest range shot, and you can see that it did hit and do some pretty decent damage. It killed 13 unit models. What happens as the unit approaches? You can see the shot pattern tends to condense into the middle of the unit, and again, even more unit models were killed there. And let's watch for a third shot as the unit again approaches. Now remember that this is a straight-on approach, just demonstrating what would happen in a straight-on approach. It's a little different if you're firing at a unit that is moving without being, moving directly towards your artillery piece. Again, see how condensed that shot pattern was right in the middle? So what it tells you about this particular artillery piece, and I'm going to slow it down here, is remember, when we fired the Mortar, at this point, the infantry unit had routed because the Mortar was condensing its damage as the unit got closer, whereas as this unit gets closer, the cannon actually kind of somewhat becomes less effective because it's condensed and hitting a smaller portion of an infantry unit. So again, this gives you an idea that a cannon is probably likely to be more effective against an infantry unit from farther away and less effective as it gets super close. If it's being used in that manner. Now, honestly, a cannon is probably better used against larger targets, but again, this just gives you an idea how these mechanics play in and how you can use them to your advantage. Let's check how this thing functions in another regard, though. The next thing I want to discuss is unit formation. So we've got a unit here in a blockier formation, and I want you to notice that it still fires at the center mass. So the cannon still aims right down the center mass, but with more units in the center mass, the shot is more devastating. So if your opponent, or the AI, is running units in a blockier formation, then the cannon will be more effective against these units, as the projectiles do tend to penetrate the entire depth of that formation. And you can see now the amount of damage in the first 2 shots is already greater than the amount of damage we saw in the first 3 shots previously, and this is caused by the blockier formation. Now, there is some worst case scenarios here to consider as well. Well, here's your absolute worst case, which is the straight-up Napoleonic, get your flutes out and start marching in column formation. Don't ever do this in front of a cannon, folks, but you can see something interesting happened. Those 2 shots, the second 2 shots, flew wide and landed here. So the first ones hit right in the center of the formation, but the 2 cannons that fired late were well off target. And it's because part of the way that the artillery targets is it's looking at the center of mass of the unit and then targeting in that direction. Well, that first hit, even though it killed these units, you can see that at first the target was kind of this tight rectangle shape here, and targeting the center mass of it was quite easy. That second shot that came off, because of the initial hit throwing bodies around, the target looked more like this on what the AI was targeting, and it was even further back here, so a couple of the targets ended up going wide. So I think it's important for you all to understand this, that as a unit gets shot up or picked apart or hit by cavalry and it's not condensed, the artillery shots may become less accurate because they are targeting that center mass, and as the center mass is pushed away, it can cause you to miss the biggest grouping of units there. a couple more things I want to look at here with the cannon. Something that's common in multiplayer, and even for the AI, is to sometimes have units in multiple lines. So say like, for instance, an infantry line, followed by a skirmish line. Now, yes, I know that these are 2 units of infantry. This is for the purpose of demonstration. When you have a low arc artillery piece, like a cannon, that has a projectile that can penetrate ranks of infantry, it can be effective to fire at groups of units like this. Now, from the longest range, I want you all to notice what happened there. 13 units of the front, and this was the unit that was targeted. The front unit was targeted, they lost 13 models. The second unit only lost 3, which means that the cannonballs at the maximum range are at their max height. If you watch, though, I'll hit play, and you can actually just ever so slightly see the arc of the cannons dropping as the unit gets closer. And as that arc drops, the cannonball is more likely to penetrate the front rank and slam through the second, giving you, well, let's call it bonus damage. So there you can see on the second shot, where both units had moved closer, the second unit took considerably more damage because the cannonballs were on a lower firing arc, pierced through the front unit, and slammed into the back, and you can see that arc is ever decreasing as the units broke closer. So this is just, again, another mechanic that I want you all to understand with the artillery in this game, so you can use it for its benefit. If you are being approached by a multi-layered formation, a cannon can be quite effective against that as the distance is closed, and the projectiles will penetrate both layers of said formation. So, just for the sake of more testing too, we put the cannon aside for a moment, and we've pulled out an organ gun, which is a low-arc artillery, but it's more mid-range, and it fires even more projectiles than the cannon. And we wanted to kind of see how it behaves in terms of targeting. So, let's observe what we can, as once again we have this infantry unit heading dead at the artillery piece, and the artillery piece is going to open fire from its max range. You can see that's this line right here. So the infantry unit will soon cross that line, and we'll check out what happens as far as targeting. Now remember, the cannon targeted straight down the center of the unit with basically every projectile on every shot. Let's see the difference now as we move into the organ gun. If you look at the spread there, it's actually kind of in 3 main groupings, but spread across the line. So it looks like that each artillery piece is kind of picking a piece of the formation to target. And because it's splitting up its shots and has even more projectiles, look at the damage. Remember, I think we killed 13 unit models in the opening salvo of the cannon, whereas this organ gun killed way more than that. It killed 36 unit models in the very first opening salvo and took off probably 30 or more % of the overall unit's health, so it was extremely devastating. We'll take a look at what happens as the distance is closed, and you can see, once again, each individual artillery piece kind of picking a different piece of the formation, and it looks like it can be anywhere from the flanks to the middle. I don't really know what drives this behavior on what the targeting is picking. Here you can see both those shots went right, one shot went middle, one went left. And so, for whatever reason, an artillery piece like the organ gun kind of picks different pieces of the formation to target, and a little bit of this might just be luck. Is it targeting the piece that you want it to? But you can notice that it does penetrate through this formation, which led us to want to test it against the double line as well. Oh, but let's not forget the good old column formation. We wanted to see this one also. No surprise there. Column formation is just not a good idea, folks. Right. Seeing the penetration damage that was done on column formation, we wanted to test, again, what happens to a multiple layer army. And the organ gun is absolutely devastating against multiple layer army. You can see the number of kills here. It's going to slow that down. I mean, it was actually equal number of kills front and back for these 2 units. Is that the exact same health? Yes, it is. Holy crap. Like, it is literally the same health. So every shot there penetrated and killed basically the same thing in both lines. So a unit like the organ gun, which again is firing on a low trajectory, high speed, spread out projectiles, you can see why it is so damaging against these types of targets. Now, we can assume that it would be very damaging against something like horse cavalry or something too. There's other factors to consider. Again, I'm just showing you some of these clips to get you an idea of how the mechanics of these different artillery pieces function. next we wanted to bring up a single entity model. So we have this War Hydra. It's a big target. It's not one of the fastest targets on the battlefield, and again, we have it running straight at the artillery piece because we want to see how the targeting of the artillery works in this particular situation. It looks like, once again, it's just targeting center of mass. There's a little variation in the way the cannonballs come in, but you can see that they're fairly effective at hitting such a large target. It just kind of depends on, again, a little bit of luck. At some point, we do have the Hydra begin a little bit of side-to-side movement just to kind of see, but as you get closer to a unit like these cannons, it gets harder to juke, and we'll talk a little bit more about artillery juking here in a minute. But you can see that, again, the artillery is doing a pretty good job at targeting the center mass of where a unit is headed, and again, at close range like this, it becomes a lot more difficult for one of these models to be missed. And you're going to see that the damage intensifies as it gets harder for the cannons to potentially miss a shot. Though moving back and forth can sometimes delay the firing of the cannons as they have to track the target. But right there you can see that was a brutal hit as multiple projectiles landed. Finally here we're going to target the organ gun just to see if it behaves similarly against the Hydra. And at the longest range it looks like it does. It's targeting pretty much center mass without having multiple unit models to target. The organ gun is just going to go straight at the center of this monster, and you can see that a lot of its shots are landing and causing fairly substantial damage. And the closer it gets, again, the easier it is for this artillery piece to land its shots. Just let you all see one more volley there. Bonus clip! You get to see the Dwarf Lord take a fire bath from the Hydra, just because we felt like it. Alright, now we're going to start the process of demonstrating how to juke artillery. So we're going to first fire at this Lord a little bit. He's running forward, and he's going to get a little closer, and we're going to show you how to juke artillery. Now, aside from a Hell Cannon and a Doom Diver catapult, which have a homing mechanic, this tactic will be pretty effective against lots of different artillery pieces. If you notice that your opponent is firing at one of your units, you can actually start to change your course. So see here, the cannon actually lands some hits. Even on a small target, as it starts to come forward, hits will start to be landed. Now what we'll do is start a little bit of serpentine movement, kind of juking back and forth. I'm going to let you see this here, and as we get in, you'll notice that Warner is going to react to the firing of the cannon and attempt to dodge most of the damage. So here you go, we're using the the organ gun to demonstrate this. When Warner sees an artillery piece fire, he just simply changes the direction of his single entity unit here, and the shots, at least from range, can be relatively easily dodged. The cannons are firing at where the unit is moving, so this is another thing for you to be aware of. You can actually do this sometimes and get the AI to spend all of their ammunition because they're too stupid to stop firing at you. When you are in a battle, if you notice your opponent doing this effectively, stop shooting at that target, or at least use it to your advantage. If they're piling a lot of micro into dodging your artillery piece, it's possible you might be able to catch them with some bad micro somewhere else, but just wanted to give you that demonstration too of artillery juking. Alright, so we've gotten to see a little bit about some of the mechanics of how these different artillery pieces work. Now I know we didn't cover every single artillery piece in the game, but I think we gave you a good idea of where to get started. Most artillery pieces in the game are fairly well represented by what we showed there, with probably the exception of, say, like a Luminarch of Hysh or a Bastillodon with a solar engine. Those are slightly different, but they actually still kind of behave in somewhat similar manners, just depending on the situation. So here comes the biggest question. What do I pick? What artillery piece should I pick? Well, here's the questions to consider when you're going through that. What is your opponent likely to field? Is it going to be monsters? Is it going to be infantry? Is it going to be cavalry? And here's the next question. What threats can be easily dealt with by artillery that are likely to be brought by your opponent? So it's kind of tied into the first one. Not only do you need to think about what they're likely to field, but can artillery effectively deal with what I think they're likely to field? And that should help drive some of your decision making. Then you should consider this question. What vulnerability is created by the artillery piece that I pick? Vulnerability meaning, what is the downside to my army? How much money am I investing in that? Let's say that, for instance, I want to pick this Black Lion's War Wagon. That is a lot of gold to invest in one unit in my army. What vulnerability does this open me up to? Is this the vampire counts, where now I've put 1900 gold into one somewhat vulnerable unit that can be swarmed by a couple of cheaper units like Fellbats? that could be very dangerous. So what is the vulnerability that I'm opening myself up to? And then I think lastly, the question you should consider is, what is the terrain in the battle? Am I playing on multiplayer crossroads, which is bare flat and wide open? Am I playing on Alpine Ridge that has a big ridge that blocks, low arc artillery right in the middle of the battlefield? You need to know the terrain that you're going to be in as well. Now, in campaign, this is a little different. It's going to change over time, and you don't have to worry about it quite as much. Obviously, I'm talking a little bit more about multiplayer. All right, and finally, what do you target with your artillery piece when you get into a battle? I'm going to give you one kind of somewhat hypothetical scenario here. Let's say that I've picked this mortar, and I'm on a map where it's going to have a, good terrain for it to be used. And my opponent has several different units on the battlefield for me to pick from. Now, I know this is an entire army, so imagine they have an entire army. And amongst this, I see these 3 targets. I see a Bleak Sword, I see a Hargoneth Executioner, and I see a Dark Shard with shields. So, what should I target? Well, you need to assess what the greatest threats are to your army, and what's going to provide the greatest value for your artillery piece. Now, if one was just going on simply that last one, the greatest value for your artillery piece, I have a 650 cost Mortar and a 1200 cost Hargoneth Executioner on the other end. I'm going to target that Hargoneth Executioner if I'm going for maximum value for the artillery piece. However, you probably shouldn't stop that examination at just value alone. You should probably also consider threats. Are the Dark Shards the biggest threat to your army's success? Is the Hargoneth Executioner the biggest threat to your army's success? That question should also play in because it can have an effect on how you're going to choose your targets, and maybe you want to spread out your damage across both these units. But this would give you an example of how to determine what you should target inside of a battle and how to best use that artillery. Remember, you paid for it. How are you going to get your money's worth out of it, and how are you going to use it to cripple your opponent and win the battle? So there you go. It's not exhaustive, but it's a good first look into teaching you a little bit more about artillery in Total War Warhammer 2. There's a lot of units, there's a lot of situations that you may find them in, and a lot of different synergies with both magic and other key units on the battlefield that can make your artillery more effective. And then, of course, that all balances up against the terrain you're on, and who you're fighting, and how well you've chosen. But again, hopefully this gives you a few ideas on how to pick things and how to target it a little more effectively in your battles, so that you can make all of those big artillery battle dreams of yours come true as you dive into the battles in Total War Warhammer 2 yourself and give this stuff a try.